Get out of this house, you idiot! Do not talk to me! The echo of my husband's scream bounced off the vaulted ceilings of our living room, mingling with the soft playing of Christmas carols. My mother-in-law, Patricia, chuckled softly, while my sister-in-law, Melanie, took a lazy sip of her champagne. They thought they had finally put me in my place. I simply gave a cold sneer, looked him dead in the eye, and replied, "Fine. My money will not contact you either." 30 minutes later, sitting in the freezing cold of my car, I logged into my banking app and watched as my husband desperately tried to call me 38 times. My name is Rebecca. I am 34 years old, and as a forensic accountant, I track hidden assets and corporate fraud for a living. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a modest Chicago neighborhood, I learned early on the value of hard work. By the time I married Bradley, I owned a beautiful downtown condo outright. Bradley, on the other hand, was the golden boy of a family that prided itself on old money and high society status. At 35, he managed a supposedly prestigious real estate investment fund started by his grandfather. His mother, Patricia, constantly reminded me that I was lucky to marry into their pristine lineage. But inside their sprawling estate, the reality was nothing but smoke and mirrors. The evening began like any other agonizing holiday dinner. The dining table was covered in expensive crystal, groaning under the weight of a catered feast that I knew Bradley could not actually afford. Bradley was visibly on edge, downing his third glass of scotch before the main course was served. Jamal, Melanie's husband, sat quietly at the far end. As a highly successful orthopedic surgeon, Jamal was the only other person there who actually worked for a living. I saw the pure exhaustion in his eyes. Patricia and Melanie treated Jamal like a walking bank account, constantly bleeding him dry to fund their lavish lifestyles. Right after dessert, Bradley reached into his designer briefcase and slapped a thick stack of legal documents onto the table, sliding them roughly over to my plate. He cleared his throat, puffing out his chest to adopt his authoritative voice. "I need you to sign these right now, Rebecca," he announced loudly. "It is a simple asset transfer for your premarital condo. The fund is experiencing a slight liquidity crunch, and I need to leverage your property to close a massive commercial deal next week. I will pay you back with interest once the deal clears." I stared down at the papers. As a forensic accountant, I spend my days tearing apart financial statements and finding exactly where the stolen money is hiding. I did not need to audit his failing company to know that signing over the only property in my name was absolute financial suicide. I calmly pushed the documents back across the table. "No, Bradley. I am not putting my condo up as collateral for your business. We agreed my property stays separate." The massive dining room went dead silent. Patricia dropped her silver fork, her face twisting in pure disgust. "You are his wife?" she hissed sharply. "A good wife supports her husband's legacy. You are just being selfish and small-minded." Melanie chimed in, immediately rolling her eyes. "Seriously, Rebecca, stop embarrassing him in front of the family. It is just a condo." Bradley's face turned violently red. He slammed his heavy fist on the table, making the expensive wine glasses rattle violently. "I am not asking you," he roared. "I am telling you. You are going to sign those papers right now, or you can get out of this house, you idiot. Do not talk to me until you learn some respect." I looked around the table. Patricia was smirking triumphantly. Melanie was laughing under her breath, whispering to a silent Jamal. They fully expected tears. They expected me to crumble, to apologize profusely, and to sign my financial life away. Instead, I stood up slowly and grabbed my coat from the back of the chair. I gave him a cold sneer. "Fine," I said, my voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of emotion. "My money will not contact you either." I turned my back on them and walked straight out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind me. The crisp winter air hit my face as I walked down the long paved driveway to my car. Once inside, I turned on the engine, but I did not put the vehicle in drive. I pulled out my phone and opened my secure banking application. Bradley thought he was a financial genius, but he was completely dependent on my pristine credit score. For the past year, he had been using a $150,000 emergency line of credit to keep his fake executive lifestyle afloat. That account was legally in my name alone. With 2 quick taps on the glowing screen, I locked the account and initiated an immediate freeze. I watched the available balance instantly drop to 0. The phone in my hand began to vibrate. It was Bradley calling. Then he called again, and again. The dominoes were finally starting to fall. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, the blue light of my phone illuminating the dark interior of my car. I watched his name flash across the screen. 10 missed calls turned into 20. 20 turned into 30. By the time the screen displayed 38 missed calls, exactly 30 minutes had passed. I had turned the heat on, sipping a lukewarm coffee I had left in the cup holder, thoroughly enjoying the silence. On the 39th attempt, I finally swiped to answer and put the phone on speaker. "Rebecca!" Bradley's voice was not a roar this time. It was a high-pitched, frantic squeak that bordered on complete hysteria. "Rebecca, you need to unlock the emergency account right now. This is not funny. The black card just declined." "I am sorry," I said, leaning back into my leather seat. "I thought you told me to get out of your house and not to talk to you." "Stop playing games!" he screamed, the panic completely overtaking his false bravado. "The catering company is packing up the food. They are threatening to call the police for theft of services. The head chef is standing in the foyer and he refuses to leave. The bill is $12,000, Rebecca. You know I do not have that kind of liquid cash in my checking account right now. You are the chief executive officer of a prestigious real estate investment fund," I replied, my voice dripping with false sympathy. "Surely a $12,000 dinner party is pocket change for a man of your legacy. Just write them a check from your corporate account." "Shut up!" He snapped, his breathing heavy and erratic. Through the speaker I could hear the chaotic background noise of the house. I could hear Patricia yelling at someone in the kitchen and Melanie loudly complaining that her holiday was ruined. "You know damn well I have not closed a single commercial deal in over 12 months, Bradley confessed, the desperation leaking through every word. "The market is terrible. I have overhead. I have image maintenance to worry about. If the caterers call the police, it will be in the local papers. It will ruin my reputation with my investors. My mother is having a panic attack. Melanie is crying. Just transfer the money from your salary. You make more than enough as a forensic accountant to cover this." I closed my eyes, letting his pathetic admission wash over me. For an entire year, I had been the invisible engine keeping his ridiculous facade alive. My 6-figure salary paid for the tailored suits he wore to meetings that went nowhere. My bonuses covered the lease on the imported sports car he parked in front of the country club. He paraded around town telling everyone he was a self-made mogul while secretly draining my income to maintain the illusion of success. And yet, despite all of my financial support, he had the absolute audacity to treat me like a disposable peasant at his dinner table, demanding I sign over my last piece of independent wealth. "That emergency line of credit was for actual emergencies," I said calmly, making sure my tone was ice cold. "It was not intended for funding a lifestyle you cannot afford to impress people who do not even like you. You wanted to be the man of the house, Bradley. You wanted to scream at me and treat me like garbage in front of your family. Now you can figure it out yourself." "Rebecca, I swear to God," he yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "If you do not wire the funds this exact second, I will make your life a living hell. I will take everything from you. I will drag you through court and take half of everything you own." "You already tried to take my condo," I reminded him. "Good luck dealing with the police tonight. Tell Patricia she might want to put on an apron and start washing dishes to work off that $12,000 debt." I pressed the red button, cutting off his frantic screaming mid-sentence. The sudden silence in the car was incredibly peaceful. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, ready to drive away and book a luxury hotel room for the night. I deserved a good night of rest away from their toxicity. But before I could shift the car into gear, a loud chime echoed through the vehicle. It was not a phone call. It was a high-priority automated text message from my premium credit monitoring service. I picked up the phone expecting it to be a standard alert confirming the credit freeze I had just initiated. Instead, my blood ran completely cold. The message read, "Alert. A new business loan application for $500,000 has been initiated using your Social Security number. Please contact fraud services immediately if this was not authorized." I stared at the glowing screen, my mind racing through the implications. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what this meant. This was not a simple mistake or a delayed processing notification. Someone had actively bypassed the initial fraud alerts and submitted a massive commercial loan application using my identity. The timing was entirely too perfect. Bradley had just realized he was completely cut off from my cash, and his immediate reaction was to commit federal wire fraud. I took a deep breath, the initial shock quickly turning into a sharp, focused anger. He thought he could outsmart a woman who catches financial criminals for a living. He had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. I arrived at my downtown Chicago accounting firm at 7 in the morning. I spent the entire night at the hotel gathering digital evidence and contacting the fraud department. By 8, I was sitting at my desk reviewing documents for my clients. The glass doors of our suite suddenly burst open. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The angry footsteps stomping across the hardwood floor belonged to Bradley. He stormed past the receptionist, pushed open the door to my private office, and slammed it shut. His designer suit looked wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. He marched to my desk, planting both hands on the wood to intimidate me. "Unlock the accounts right now, Rebecca," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. I had to beg my mother for a loan to pay the caterers. Do you know how humiliating that was? You are going to fix this. You are going to call the bank, lift the freeze, and then you are going to sign the condo over to me by noon. If you do not, I am going to walk right out of this room and have a very long chat with your managing partner. I kept my eyes on my spreadsheet, typing a few numbers before finally looking up at him. "Is that so?" I asked mildly. "And what exactly are you going to tell him?" "I am going to tell him that his top forensic accountant is having a severe mental breakdown," Bradley sneered, leaning in closer. "I will tell him you have become completely unstable, paranoid, and financially abusive toward your husband. I will say you are locking up our joint marital assets out of pure spite and delusion. No accounting firm wants a liability like that handling their high-net-worth clients. They will fire you on the spot." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and smiled. Bradley always relied on bullying to get his way, assuming everyone else was as terrified of public scandal as his family was. But I did not work for his family. I worked for one of the most ruthless forensic accounting firms in the Midwest. Before Bradley could say another word, the heavy wooden door connecting my office to the executive suite swung open. My boss, Mr. Henderson, walked in. He was a towering man with 20 years of experience investigating corporate embezzlement. He did not look amused. "Actually, Bradley," Mr. Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. "Rebecca has already briefed me on the situation. She came in early to disclose a potential conflict of interest regarding your family fund." Bradley froze slowly, standing up straight. His arrogant smirk faltered for a second, but he quickly tried to recover. "Mr. Henderson," he began using his fake professional voice. "I apologize for the interruption. My wife is going through a very difficult manic episode right now. I am just trying to get her home so she can get the psychiatric help she needs." Mr. Henderson ignored him completely. He walked over to my desk and handed Bradley a stiff white envelope. "This is a formal notice of trespass," Mr. Henderson said firmly. "You are no longer permitted on these premises. If you do not leave immediately, building security will escort you out in handcuffs." Bradley stared at the envelope as if it were on fire. He turned his furious gaze back to me. "You think a piece of paper scares me," he spat. "You think you can just shut me out. I am your husband. Half of everything you have is mine." I stood up, resting my hands on the desk. "You mean like the $500,000 commercial loan you tried to open in my name last night?" I asked loudly, making sure my voice carried. Bradley went completely pale. His jaw clenched tight. "I do not know what you are talking about," he lied, though his eyes darted nervously toward the door. I filed a police report for identity theft at 2 o'clock this morning. I told him, my tone completely flat and unyielding. The fraud department at the bank has already flagged the IP address used to submit the application. It traces directly back to the router in your home office. You committed federal wire fraud, Bradley. He let out a sharp, breathless laugh, trying to mask his rising panic. You cannot prove anything, he sneered, pointing a shaking finger at me. We are married. The courts will consider it a joint financial decision. You have no case. And since you want to play dirty, I am calling my wealth manager right now. I am going to drain every single penny out of your retirement account before lunch. You are going to wish you just signed over that condo. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, shoving the glass door so hard it rattled in its frame. I sat back down, taking a slow sip of my coffee. My phone vibrated on the desk just as I set my coffee mug down. I expected it to be the bank or the police following up on my fraud report. Instead, the caller ID displayed Jamal. I answered immediately. His voice was hushed and strained, a stark contrast to his usual confident bedside manner. He asked if I could meet him for an emergency lunch at a quiet diner a few blocks from his hospital. I agreed without hesitation. When I walked into the diner at noon, Jamal was already sitting in a back booth. The man looked completely exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and the dark circles under his eyes were prominent against his dark skin. He had barely touched the glass of water in front of him. I slid into the booth across from him. He looked around nervously before leaning in close. Bradley cornered me in the hospital parking garage this morning, Jamal said, his voice thick with frustration. He was sweating through his suit and pacing like a madman. He begged me for a $300,000 bridge loan. He said it was an absolute emergency to save a massive commercial property downtown. He promised he would pay me back with 20% interest by the end of the month. I listened quietly, watching the exhaustion radiating from my brother-in-law. Did you give him the money? I asked. Jamal rubbed his temples and let out a long, heavy sigh. I cannot give him the money, Rebecca. I am completely tapped out. I frowned, confused by his admission. You are one of the top orthopedic surgeons in the state, Jamal. How can you be tapped out? That is when the dam finally broke. Jamal looked down at the table and confessed a secret he had been hiding for 2 years. He had been secretly funding the entire family. Whenever Bradley had a liquidity issue, he went straight to Jamal. Whenever Patricia wanted to host an extravagant charity gala to show off to her country club friends, Jamal footed the bill. And Melanie, his wife, demanded a lifestyle of constant luxury vacations, designer bags, and imported cars to maintain her fake influencer image on social media. Jamal admitted that he had been draining his surgical income and liquidating his own stock portfolios just to keep the peace. He wanted to give Melanie the life she thought she deserved, but the demands never stopped. He was working 80-hour weeks doing back-to-back surgeries just to pay for Bradley and his failing fund. I told Melanie we need to downsize, Jamal whispered, looking utterly defeated. I told her we need to sell the mansion and move into something reasonable. She threw a glass at the wall and threatened to leave me. She said I was trying to ruin her family legacy. Rebecca, I do not know what to do anymore. I am drowning, and Bradley is asking for another $300,000 just to keep his commercial property from going under. I felt a deep surge of pity for Jamal. He was a good, hard-working man who had been completely manipulated by a family of financial parasites. They preyed on his generosity and his desire to provide for his wife. But my pity quickly turned into cold, calculated anger toward Bradley. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, setting it on the table between us. I connected to the diner internet and opened my encrypted work files. Jamal watched me with a confused expression as I navigated through the forensic data I had compiled the night before. Jamal, you need to listen to me very carefully, I said, keeping my voice low but incredibly firm. You are not going to give Bradley a single dime, and you are going to call your bank right now and lock down any joint accounts you share with Melanie. Jamal blinked, his eyes widening. Why? What is going on? I turned the laptop screen toward him. I opened the public property records database for the county and pulled up the exact downtown commercial building Bradley had claimed he needed the bridge loan to save. I pointed to the glowing red text at the top of the official document. "Read the status of this property," I instructed. Jamal leaned forward, squinting at the screen. His breath hitched in his throat. "It says foreclosed. The date of foreclosure is 6 months ago." "Exactly," I said, closing the laptop. "Bradley does not own that property anymore. The bank repossessed it half a year ago. There is no bridge loan needed to save it because it is already gone." Jamal stared at me, his mind struggling to process the information. "But if the property is gone, why does he need $300,000 right now? Where is the money going, Rebecca?" I looked him dead in the eye, delivering the terrifying truth. "He is not making bad real estate investments, Jamal. He is paying off his old investors with the money he brings in from new investors. The catering bill last night, the desperate garage ambush this morning, the forged loan documents in my name. He is running out of fresh cash to keep the illusion alive. Bradley is running a massive Ponzi scheme, and it is about to completely collapse." Jamal sat frozen. The blood drained from his face as my words sank in. He did not ask questions. He stood up, threw a $20 bill on the table, and told me he was going straight to the bank to sever every joint account with Melanie. I watched him rush out the door, feeling relief that at least one innocent person was getting out of the blast radius. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Patricia. It was a strict command telling me to meet her at an upscale cafe 2 blocks away in 15 minutes. I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what this was. Patricia was the mastermind behind his massive ego stepping in for damage control. I paid my bill and walked outside into the crisp afternoon air. I unlocked my phone, opened the voice memo application, and hit the red record button. I slipped the device into the front pocket of my blazer, making sure the microphone was completely unobstructed. I walked into the cafe and immediately spotted her. Patricia was sitting at a corner table looking immaculate in a tailored designer suit with her trademark pearl necklace. She was sipping sparkling water and glaring at the baristas as if they were entirely beneath her notice. I walked over and took the seat across from her without saying a single word. Patricia set her glass down and leaned forward. "I am going to make this very quick, Rebecca," she said, her tone dripping with absolute condescension. "You have thrown a childish temper tantrum and embarrassed my son. I am here to offer you a way out before you completely ruin your own life." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my posture completely relaxed. "I am listening," I replied simply. "Here is the deal," Patricia stated, crossing her arms. "You are going to go home tonight and apologize to Bradley for your erratic behavior. First thing tomorrow morning, you will call your bank to unlock the credit line. Then you will sign the deed to your condo over to the family fund. If you do these things, we will sweep this unfortunate episode under the rug. You can go back to pretending you belong in our family." I let out a short, genuine laugh. "You want me to apologize to the man who screamed at me and threw me out of my own home?" I asked. "And you want me to hand over my only independent asset to a failing company? Why on earth would I do that?" "Because if you do not, I will destroy you," Patricia replied. Her eyes narrowed. "I sit on the board for 3 major financial institutions in this city. I play tennis with the managing partners of every elite accounting firm. If you refuse my offer, I will make one phone call. I will tell them you are an unstable employee who steals from her family. You will be blacklisted. You will never work as an accountant in Illinois again." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us. She thought she was holding all the cards. She thought her high society connections made her untouchable. I decided to press exactly the right button to stroke her massive ego. "Did you tell Bradley to do this?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and defeated. "Did you tell him to take all my money?" Patricia smiled a cold, wicked grin. She leaned back in her chair, looking incredibly proud of herself. "Of course I did," she boasted. "A man of his stature cannot be burdened by a wife who thinks she is an equal. I taught Bradley years ago that the only way to tame a woman like you is to make her completely financially dependent. You are getting entirely too arrogant with your little career. It was time to put you back in your place." "So you also told him to commit federal wire fraud?" I asked, leaning in slightly. "You told him to forge my signature on that $500,000 commercial loan application last night," Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, please, Rebecca, do not be so dramatic. You are married to him. What is yours is his anyway. Forging your signature was just cutting through unnecessary red tape to get the capital our family deserves. I told him to do it because we urgently needed the cash quickly. It is not fraud when it is family. I smiled slowly, feeling the weight of the recording device inside my pocket. You are right, Patricia, I said, standing up. It is not simple fraud. It is a fully documented criminal conspiracy. I turned and walked straight out of the door, leaving her looking utterly confused. I carried her recorded confession directly to my lawyer. I walked straight from the cafe to the sleek glass building where my attorney David had his practice. I handed him the digital audio file and sat in his leather chair as he listened to Patricia proudly confess to conspiracy. David was a former prosecutor, and he did not mince words. He told me the recording was a silver bullet for the criminal investigation, but the civil fallout with Bradley was going to get incredibly messy. I had no idea just how messy until I returned to my condo that evening. As I stepped out of the elevator onto my floor, a man in a gray jacket stepped out of the shadows. He asked if I was Rebecca. When I nodded, he shoved a thick manila envelope into my chest, muttered, "You have been served," and practically ran back toward the stairwell. I unlocked my door, threw my keys on the granite counter, and tore open the envelope. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. Bradley was filing for divorce. He had beaten me to the courthouse by mere hours. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my kitchen island reading through the petition. I expected Bradley to play dirty, but the sheer audacity of his demands actually made me laugh out loud in the empty room. He was not just asking for a standard division of assets. He was demanding permanent spousal support, claiming he had grown accustomed to a high-net-worth lifestyle during our marriage and that he needed my income to maintain his standard of living. He petitioned the court for exclusive ownership of my premarital condo, arguing it was somehow commingled marital property because he occasionally paid the utility bills. But the most unhinged part of the document was tucked into page 12 under the section detailing marital debts. Bradley was officially claiming that I was the financial mastermind behind his family investment fund. He spun a wild, legally terrifying narrative stating that he was merely the public face of the company, while I handled all the accounting investments and capital allocation. It was a desperate, calculated move. He knew the entire Ponzi scheme was collapsing. He knew the authorities would be looking for the missing millions. He was actively laying the groundwork to throw me under the federal bus and shift all his wire fraud and tax evasion charges directly onto my shoulders. He wanted to make me the scapegoat for his complete financial ruin. I kept flipping through the heavy stack of papers looking for the legal basis he was using to claim my condo and tie me to his fraudulent business. I found it neatly stapled at the very back, labeled as Exhibit A. It was a formal post-nuptial agreement dated exactly 14 months ago. I stared at the heavy parchment paper, my blood pressure rising with every single word I read. The document explicitly stated that I agreed to take full fiduciary responsibility for his investment fund and that I willingly surrendered all rights to my personal real estate in the event of a divorce. At the bottom of the final page was my signature. It was a nearly perfect forgery, copying the exact loop and slant of my letters. Next to the forged signature was a bright blue notary stamp and the signature of a licensed public notary. I recognized the name immediately. He was a sleazy golf buddy of Bradley who frequently attended the extravagant country club mixers Patricia hosted. They had colluded to forge a legally binding contract right under my nose. Bradley thought this fake document was his ultimate trump card. He thought he could use a corrupt friend with a notary stamp to steal my home, drain my retirement accounts, and send me to federal prison in his place. As a forensic accountant, I immediately started analyzing the physical document. I looked at the date stamped on the top right corner, October 14th of last year. I closed my eyes and mentally scanned my work travel calendar from that month. A slow smile spread across my face as I realized exactly where I had been on that specific date. Bradley had made a massive logistical error. The forgery was visually good, but the execution was incredibly sloppy. My phone rang loudly, shattering the quiet tension in my kitchen. It was David, my lawyer. He had just received the electronic copy of the divorce filing from the opposing legal team. David sounded incredibly tense, which was rare for a man who handled high-stakes litigation for a living. He told me the judge had fast-tracked our case and scheduled an emergency mediation hearing for this upcoming Friday morning. Bradley had hired one of the most aggressive and expensive divorce attorneys in Chicago, using the stolen money from his investors. They had filed an emergency motion to enforce the post-nuptial agreement immediately. David warned me in a grave tone that if the mediator and the judge accepted that forged document as valid on Friday, the court would instantly freeze every single bank account I owned. I would lose access to my money, my condo, and my ability to fund a legal defense against the impending federal fraud charges. I had exactly 48 hours to prove the document was a complete fabrication, or Bradley was going to successfully take everything I had ever worked for and leave me holding the bag for his crimes. Friday morning arrived with a torrential downpour washing over the streets of downtown Chicago. I walked into the courthouse with my attorney David, feeling a cold sense of absolute clarity. We took the elevator up to the private mediation suites on the 14th floor. When we entered the conference room, Bradley was already seated. He was wearing his most expensive navy suit, looking incredibly smug. Next to him sat his high-priced divorce attorney, Mr. Pierce. The mediator, a stern former judge named Ms. Reynolds, sat at the head of the long mahogany table. As soon as everyone was seated, Bradley began his performance. He played the role of the devastated victim perfectly. He slumped his shoulders, let out a long, trembling sigh, and looked down at his hands as if the entire ordeal was breaking his heart. Mr. Pierce immediately took control of the room. He spoke with a smooth, condescending tone, stating that they were here to expedite the process and enforce the existing legal framework of our marriage. Mr. Pierce unclasped his leather briefcase and dramatically slid the forged post-nuptial agreement across the polished wood table. He addressed the mediator directly, claiming that during a joint business trip to New York last October, I had willingly signed this document. He argued that I had officially taken full fiduciary responsibility for the family investment fund and surrendered all rights to my personal real estate. He painted me as a cold, calculating financial mastermind who was now trying to back out of a legally binding contract because the market had taken a downturn. David sat perfectly still, letting Mr. Pierce finish his arrogant monologue. Then David adjusted his glasses and looked across the table. "Before we enforce this document," David said calmly, "I request the original logbook from the notary public, who supposedly witnessed this signature." Mr. Pierce waved his hand dismissively. "That is entirely unnecessary," he scoffed. "The document bears a certified state notary stamp. It is a fully authenticated legal instrument." "That is exactly the problem," David replied, opening his own briefcase. "Because my client is a certified forensic accountant, she decided to do a little routine auditing on this authenticated legal instrument." This was my moment. I pulled out a thick stack of printed financial records and slid them across the table toward Ms. Reynolds. I kept my eyes locked directly on Bradley as I spoke. "The document you just presented claims I signed it in a hotel conference room in New York on October 14th, I said, my voice completely steady. "But as a forensic accountant, I know that every single financial transaction leaves a permanent digital footprint." I pointed to the first page of the stack. "I hired a private investigator to pull the public social media records and legally obtained flight manifests for your notary public. On October 12th, he boarded a commercial flight to Miami, Florida. He did not return until October 18th. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The smug look began to melt off his face, replaced by a sudden flash of panic. Mr. Pierce quickly reached for the documents, but Miss Reynolds grabbed them first. I did not stop there. I continued, leaning forward. "If you turn to the third page, you will see the credit card receipts we obtained from the luxury resort in Miami. On the exact date and exact hour that he supposedly watched me sign this document in New York, he was actually paying for a round of poolside margaritas in Florida. We have the time-stamped receipts, the hotel folio, and his social media photograph holding his drink at the cabana. The silence in the mediation room was absolutely deafening. Miss Reynolds flipped through the undeniable evidence, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. She was a professional who despised having her time wasted, and she absolutely loathed being lied to in her own mediation room. She threw the forged post-nuptial agreement back across the table where it slid and hit Mr. Pierce in the chest. "This document is a complete fabrication," she stated, her voice shaking with anger. "It is a fraudulent instrument submitted under penalty of perjury. I am immediately rejecting this petition, and I will be contacting the State Bar Association this afternoon to report you for submitting forged evidence, Mr. Pierce." Mr. Pierce turned completely pale, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. He looked at Bradley with pure fury, realizing his client had just jeopardized his entire legal career. But Bradley did not care about his lawyer. His eyes were wide, wild, and completely unhinged. The realization that his ultimate trump card had just been destroyed completely broke his mind. He let out a visceral, guttural scream. Before anyone could react, Bradley planted his hands on the table, vaulted over the mahogany wood, and lunged violently straight at my throat. Before Bradley could wrap his hands around my neck, David tackled him sideways. The heavy leather chairs crashed to the floor as the two men tangled on the expensive carpet. Ms. Reynolds slammed her hand down on the emergency security button located under her desk. Within seconds, two armed courthouse deputies burst through the heavy wooden doors. They hauled Bradley off the floor, twisting his arms behind his back and snapping cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. Mr. Pierce was already packing his briefcase, refusing to even look at his client, as Bradley was dragged out of the conference room screaming obscenities at me. The failed mediation was a massive blow to Bradley, but his family refused to surrender. Instead of accepting defeat, they decided to change the battlefield. They realized they could not beat me in a court of law with physical evidence, so they decided to try and destroy me in the court of public opinion. That evening, my phone began vibrating continuously on my kitchen counter. It was not Bradley calling this time. It was a flood of notifications from social media. I opened my feed and saw a video that was already gaining thousands of views. It was Melanie. She was sitting in her lavish living room wearing an oversized cashmere sweater, looking intentionally disheveled. She had clearly rubbed her eyes to make them red and puffy. She stared directly into the camera and began to cry on command. "Guys, I usually keep my family life private," she whimpered, wiping away a fake tear. "But my family is going through an absolute nightmare right now. My brother Bradley is a victim of severe emotional and financial abuse. His wife Rebecca is using her position as an accountant to systematically steal from our family fund and bankrupt our legacy business. She is locking him out of his own accounts and trying to leave him with absolutely nothing. Please share this so people know the truth about who they are trusting with their finances." The video was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. Melanie had a sizable following of local socialites and wealthy housewives. Within 2 hours, the video had gone completely viral within the Chicago business community. The comment section was a mob calling for my accounting license to be revoked immediately. Then the client calls started. The first was from a major corporate client who had trusted me to audit their upcoming merger. They sounded nervous, asking if there was any truth to the embezzlement rumors circulating online. By the time I received the fourth anxious call, my boss, Mr. Henderson, had to step in. He told me that while he fully supported me, the firm could not afford a public relations disaster of this magnitude. He gently suggested I take a temporary leave of absence until the dust settled. I felt a heavy knot form in my stomach as I realized Melanie was actively destroying my professional reputation. While I was sitting in my living room watching my career burn, Jamal was experiencing his own breaking point. He had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. He sat in his car in the driveway of his massive house and opened his phone to check the news. The social media algorithm immediately pushed his wife's crying face to the top of his feed. He watched the entire video, listening to Melanie spin a web of malicious lies to protect a brother she fully knew was running a Ponzi scheme. Jamal walked through the front door of their home. Melanie was sitting on the velvet sofa, sipping a glass of red wine and smiling brightly as she rapidly refreshed her page to check her climbing view count. She did not even look up when he entered. She just giggled and muttered something about going viral. Jamal did not say a single word to her. He walked straight past the living room and up the sweeping staircase to their master bedroom. He pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and began throwing his scrub's casual clothes and essential documents inside. For 2 years he had funded her absolute vanity. He had drained his own accounts to keep her failing family afloat. But watching her gleefully try to destroy an innocent woman who had actually tried to warn him was the absolute final straw. Jamal zipped up the duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked back down the stairs. He walked right out the front door without looking back, leaving Melanie completely absorbed in her glowing screen. I was staring blankly at my laptop, wondering how I was going to salvage my career when my phone chimed with a text message. It was from Jamal. The message was short, and it changed the entire trajectory of the war. It simply read, "I saw the video. I packed my bags, and I left her. I am in Rebecca. Let us burn it down." I stared at the text message glowing on my screen. I did not hesitate for a single second. I called Jamal immediately. He answered on the first ring, the background noise indicating he was driving away from his massive house. I told him Melanie had just launched a public smear campaign against me to save her brother. Jamal sounded remarkably calm, a stark contrast to the exhausted man I had spoken with at the diner. He told me he was completely done being their collateral damage and he had a plan. When he married Melanie, Patricia had insisted on putting him on the board of the primary family trust. They did it to use his pristine credit score and medical license as a guarantor for their shady financial dealings. Jamal asked me a very simple legal question. As a documented trustee, what happens if he suspects the managing partner of committing wire fraud? I smiled deeply. I told him he had a strict fiduciary duty to freeze those funds and transfer them into a secure escrow account pending a federal investigation. Jamal thanked me, hung up the phone, and drove straight to his private bank. While Jamal was sitting in a plush leather chair signing documents at his bank, Bradley was in a state of full-blown panic. He had just been released from a holding cell after his violent outburst at the courthouse. His high-priced lawyer, Mr. Pierce, had formally dropped him as a client and completely blocked his phone number. Bradley knew the walls were closing in rapidly. His Ponzi scheme was entirely starved of fresh capital, and the police were actively investigating the forged loan document. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately to flee the jurisdiction before federal agents started knocking on his front door. He rushed into his home office, locking the heavy mahogany door behind him. He opened his laptop, his hands shaking violently as he typed in his master administrative password for the family trust account. It was his final safety net, holding just under $2 million in liquid assets stolen from his remaining investors. The banking portal loaded agonizingly slow on his screen. Bradley gripped the edges of his desk, sweat dripping down his forehead. He mentally calculated how much he could wire to an offshore account in the Caymans before the daily fraud limit stopped him. But when the financial dashboard finally rendered, his eyes went wide. The bold black numbers at the top of the screen did not read $2 million. The balance displayed was exactly $0.00. He hit the refresh button frantically. He pounded his fists against the keyboard. The zero remained. Breathing heavily, he dialed the executive customer service line. A representative calmly informed him that his fellow trustee, Dr. Jamal, had executed an emergency fiduciary transfer just 1 hour prior. The entire balance had been legally moved into an untouchable escrow account due to pending fraud allegations. Bradley dropped his phone. The screen shattered against the hardwood floor. He had absolutely nothing. No money, no lawyer, and no escape route. Complete desperation quickly turned into pure unhinged rage. Bradley stormed out of his house and jumped into his leased sports car. He drove recklessly across town, swerving through traffic and running red lights until he reached the prestigious private hospital where Jamal worked. Bradley did not care about optics or his high society reputation anymore. He shoved past the revolving glass doors and marched right into the crowded main lobby. He began screaming Jamal's name at the top of his lungs. Nurses, doctors, and patients turned to stare in absolute horror as the supposed real estate mogul threw a complete temper tantrum. Bradley slammed his fists on the pristine marble reception desk, demanding the hospital staff bring his brother-in-law down immediately. He screamed that Jamal was a lying thief who had stolen his family fortune. The elevator doors chimed and opened. Jamal stepped out into the expansive lobby, looking immaculate in his tailored white coat. He was not alone. 4 massive hospital security guards flanked him. Bradley lunged forward, his face purple with rage, but 2 guards immediately tackled him to the polished floor. Jamal stood tall, looking down at the pathetic man who had treated him like a personal bank for 2 years. Bradley thrashed against the guards, screaming obscenities and demanding his money back. Jamal did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted his stethoscope and looked at the head of security. "Get this violent trespasser out of my hospital," Jamal ordered calmly, "and if he comes back, call the police." The guards hauled Bradley up by his arms, dragging his custom leather shoes across the lobby floor. Dozens of people had their phones out, recording the magnificent downfall of the golden boy. I received the video of Bradley being thrown onto the concrete sidewalk 10 minutes later, but my satisfaction was cut short. Bradley was out of options, and a cornered animal is always the most dangerous kind. I watched the video of Bradley hitting the concrete sidewalk before closing my laptop. My satisfaction quickly became a calculating sense of urgency. Bradley was officially out of options, and a cornered animal is always dangerous. I knew exactly how financial criminals operated when walls closed in. They panic. They liquidate physical assets for pennies to get enough cash to flee or silence creditors. I logged into my terminal and began monitoring every asset registry linked to his name. It did not take long for his utter desperation to manifest. Early the next morning, my alert system pinged loudly. Several prominent investors in his fraudulent real estate fund had seen Melanie's disastrous viral video and were now actively demanding their capital back. Bradley was receiving furious text messages and voicemails from wealthy businessmen threatening him with private investigators and immediate federal lawsuits. With the family trust account completely frozen by Jamal and his mother, Patricia, scrambling to protect her own dwindling socialite funds, Bradley was forced to make a deeply painful sacrifice. He had to sell his ultimate status symbol to survive the week. Docked at a highly exclusive marina on Lake Michigan was a sleek 60-foot luxury yacht. Bradley had purchased it 3 years ago using misappropriated investor funds just to host lavish parties for his pretentious country club friends. He had arrogantly named it The Legacy. It was his absolute pride and joy, a floating monument to his massive unearned ego. The yacht featured a custom mahogany interior, a full wet bar, and a master cabin fitted with imported Italian leather. On paper, the vessel was easily worth $2.5 million. But Bradley did not have the luxury of time to find a proper wealthy buyer. He needed untraceable cash immediately. Through a quiet maritime broker, he listed the yacht for a heavily discounted fire sale price of exactly $500,000 with a demand for an immediate same-day closing. As a forensic accountant actively tracking his financial footprint, I saw the private listing the exact minute it went live on the broker network. A brilliant, perfectly legal trap immediately formed in my mind. I had a significant amount of liquid capital saved in an independent high-yield account entirely from my annual corporate bonuses. I called my attorney David and instructed him to rapidly form an anonymous shell corporation in Delaware to mask my identity. We officially named the entity Blue Water Holdings, LLC. Within 2 hours, David had a trusted maritime agent contact the broker representing Bradley with a full cash offer. The terms were simple and undeniable. $500,000 wired directly into his personal checking account in exchange for the immediate unconditional transfer of the yacht deed. There would be no marine surveys, no inspections, and no delays. Bradley was so blinded by his sheer panic that he did not even question the identity of the anonymous buyer. He rushed down to the harbor master office that very afternoon. The sky over Lake Michigan was overcast and bitterly cold, perfectly matching his grim reality. He sat across from my hired agent in the cramped marina office, bouncing his leg in anxiety. My agent placed the heavy stack of transfer documents on the desk. Bradley snatched the pen and began frantically signing his name on every single dotted line without reading a single paragraph. He just wanted the cash to pay off the two angry investors who were threatening to go straight to the FBI. With an aggressive stroke of his pen, Bradley signed the master deed over to Blue Water Holdings, LLC. My agent calmly reviewed the signatures, stamped the documents with a seal of approval, and authorized the wire transfer of $500,000 to Bradley. Bradley let out a massive sigh of relief, leaning back in his chair as his phone buzzed with the bank deposit notification. He thought he had just bought himself a few more weeks of freedom and dodged a federal indictment. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, and smugly asked the agent who the lucky new owner of his beautiful boat was. My agent silently packed the original signed legal deed into his briefcase and snapped the lock shut. He looked Bradley dead in the eye and handed him the final executed copy of the transfer paperwork. The agent simply pointed to the fine print at the very bottom of the page where the managing director of Blue Water Holdings, LLC was legally required to be disclosed. Bradley looked down at the paper. His smug expression instantly evaporated, replaced by sheer, absolute horror. Right there, printed in bold black ink, was my full legal name, Rebecca. He had just sold his multi-million-dollar pride and joy to his estranged wife for absolute pennies. Despite staring directly at my name on the legal deed, Bradley simply refused to accept reality. His fractured mind convinced him that because the official maritime registry took 48 hours to update in the public database, he still had a narrow window to maintain his illusion. He desperately needed to calm the wealthy investors who were threatening federal lawsuits. In a move of pure, unhinged arrogance, he used a portion of the $500,000 I had just wired him to cater a massive Saturday evening gala on the very yacht he no longer owned. The harbor was glowing under the twilight sky that weekend. The Legacy was illuminated by underwater lights and string lanterns. An expensive string quartet played softly on the upper deck, while white-gloved staff carried trays of imported caviar. Bradley stood near the helm, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, laughing loudly and slapping the backs of the exact businessmen who had been threatening him days prior. Patricia and Melanie were holding court near the wet bar, draped in designer gowns, acting as if they were maritime royalty. Bradley was delivering a charismatic speech about his fund's upcoming expansion, assuring everyone that the rumors of his insolvency were nothing but vicious gossip. He was mid-sentence when the blinding white spotlight of a Chicago Harbor Police patrol boat suddenly illuminated the entire deck. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The wealthy guests shielded their eyes, murmuring in confusion, as the heavily armored police boat pulled up flush against the starboard side of the luxury yacht. Two uniformed maritime officers stepped over the railing, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. I stepped onto the deck, right behind them, wearing a sharp crimson trench coat and holding a thick waterproof folder. Bradley froze his champagne flute, hovering inches from his mouth, his face drained of all color. Patricia dropped her glass, shattering it against the polished mahogany deck. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradley demanded, trying to project a voice of authority that violently cracked. "Officers, remove this woman immediately. She is trespassing on a private vessel." The lead officer did not even look at him. He turned to me and nodded. I opened the folder and pulled out the master deed, freshly stamped and legally certified by the state of Illinois. "Actually, Bradley," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent deck so every single elite investor could hear. "As the sole managing director of Blue Water Holdings, LLC, I am the legal owner of this vessel. The transaction was finalized on Thursday afternoon. I am here to take possession of my property, and you are currently trespassing." The guests gasped. A prominent venture capitalist who had just invested $2 million into Bradley's fund stepped forward, his face twisting in absolute fury. Bradley, the investor, barked, "Did you just sell this boat out from under us to pay your debts?" Bradley stammered, his eyes darting frantically looking for an exit that did not exist. "It is a misunderstanding," he pleaded, holding his hands up toward the crowd. "She is a disgruntled ex-wife trying to ruin a completely standard corporate restructuring." "It is not a misunderstanding," I replied loudly, handing the verified deed to the lead investor so he could read my name for himself. "He sold it for pennies because he is completely bankrupt. There is no corporate restructuring. There is only a desperate man running a massive Ponzi scheme who just ran out of your money." The reaction was instantaneous. The investors began shouting, demanding their capital back, pulling out their phones to call their legal teams. The officers stepped between the angry crowd and Bradley, instructing everyone to disembark immediately, as the vessel was now under new ownership. The humiliation was absolute. Bradley, Melanie, and Patricia were forced to endure a grueling walk of shame down the gangway surrounded by furious billionaires who now knew they were nothing but common thieves. They stepped onto the wooden planks of the marina dock, stripped of their power and their fake wealth. Patricia could not handle the public destruction of her social standing. As the last investor walked past her, throwing a look of pure disgust, she suddenly grabbed her chest. She let out a dramatic gasp and collapsed onto the hard wooden dock, flailing her arms and screaming that she was having a massive heart attack. Melanie fell to her knees, wailing loudly, begging the police to call an ambulance. The paramedics arrived within 5 minutes, rushing down the dock with a stretcher. They knelt beside Patricia, quickly attaching a heart monitor and checking her vitals. The crowd of investors lingered on the pier, watching the scene unfold. The lead paramedic stared at the perfectly normal sinus rhythm on the monitor. He sighed heavily, packing his stethoscope away. "Ma'am," the paramedic announced, his voice booming across the quiet marina. "Your heart rate is perfectly normal, and your blood pressure is completely stable. We are not operating a taxi service for panic attacks. You are faking it. Get up." The entire crowd erupted into cold, mocking laughter. Patricia opened her eyes, her face burning crimson red as she realized her ultimate sympathy play had just failed spectacularly. She was left sitting on the dirty wooden dock, completely exposed, utterly humiliated, and entirely out of options. The humiliation on the marina dock was only the public execution of his pride. The true legal slaughter occurred 5 days later inside a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Chicago. We were gathered for his official divorce deposition. Since Mr. Pierce had abruptly dropped him after the forged document fiasco, Bradley was forced to hire a discount strip mall attorney who looked completely out of his depth. Bradley sat across the table from me, sweating through a cheap dress shirt. His arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by the nervous twitching of a cornered suspect. A certified court reporter sat at the end of the table, ready to transcribe every single word he spoke, under penalty of perjury. My attorney, David, adjusted his glasses and started the recording device. He reminded Bradley that he was under oath and that lying during a deposition carried severe criminal penalties. Bradley nodded sharply, refusing to make eye contact with me. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He immediately opened a thick binder and launched straight into the financial anatomy of the family investment fund. "Let us discuss the missing capital, Bradley." David began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "According to the internal ledgers my client recovered, your fund took in roughly $2 million from private investors over the last 18 months. However, the operating accounts show 0 successful real estate acquisitions during that time. Where exactly did the $2 million go?" Bradley swallowed hard. His cheap lawyer weakly attempted to object, claiming the fund's business was separate from the divorce proceedings. David ruthlessly shot him down, stating that Bradley had officially claimed the fund as marital property in his initial filing. The discount attorney instantly folded and instructed his client to answer the question. Bradley leaned back, crossing his arms in a pathetic attempt to look defensive. "The market was volatile," he muttered, staring at the wall. "Real estate is unpredictable. The capital was used for overhead maintenance and covering outstanding debts." David flipped a page in his binder. "Outstanding debts," he repeated sharply. "Are you referring to the massive debts left behind by your predecessor?" This was the pressure point. Bradley had spent his entire life bragging about his wealthy family lineage and the pristine legacy his father had built. But faced with the terrifying reality of federal prison, his loyalty completely evaporated. He needed a scapegoat, and the only person who could not defend themselves was dead. Yes, Bradley snapped, his voice rising in defensive anger. My father was careless. Everyone thought he was a genius, but he was secretly bleeding the company dry for years before he passed away. When I took over, the fund was already a massive sinking ship. I spent the last 3 years desperately moving money around, just trying to cover up his catastrophic financial mistakes. I was trying to save the family name. The missing money went to paying off his secret creditors. It was not my fault. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rapid clicking of the stenographer machine. It was beautifully tragic. In less than 2 minutes, Bradley had completely destroyed his own sacred family legacy on the official legal record. He had just admitted under oath that his father was a massive fraud and that their entire high society status was built on a mountain of hidden debt. Patricia would have a genuine heart attack if she ever read this transcript. David looked at me and gave a subtle nod. It was time for the final blow. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of Bradley. If you were desperately paying off your father's secret creditors to save the family name, I said, breaking my silence, then you must explain this particular transaction. Bradley looked down at the paper. It was a certified bank statement obtained through a specialized forensic subpoena. His discount lawyer leaned over to look at it and instantly went pale. That is a wire transfer confirmation, I stated clearly, making sure the court reporter caught every syllable. It shows exactly $500,000 being moved from the primary investor escrow account into a private offshore holding company located in the Cayman Islands. Bradley began to tremble. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I want you to look very closely at the timestamp on that transfer, Bradley. I continued, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. You executed that offshore wire transfer at exactly 9 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve. That was exactly 24 hours after you kicked me out of our house and told me my money would no longer contact you. You were not paying your father's debts. You were hiding stolen money to fund your escape. The discount attorney immediately threw his hands up in the air and requested an emergency recess, realizing his client had just confessed to massive federal crimes. But the damage was already permanently recorded. Bradley stared at the Cayman Islands document, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He finally realized that I had tracked every single penny he had ever touched. The following Tuesday, I was walking out of an upscale grocery store, pushing a cart filled with organic produce toward my car. The wind was biting, tearing through the parking lot. As I reached for my door handle, a figure stepped out from behind a large SUV, completely blocking my path. It was Melanie. She looked entirely unrecognizable from the glamorous influencer who had tried to destroy me online just a week prior. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her hair was unwashed and tied in a messy bun, and her hands were trembling violently. "Rebecca, wait," she gasped, stepping closer. "I need to talk to you. You have to listen to me." I gripped the handle of my cart, keeping it firmly between us as a physical barrier. "I have absolutely nothing to say to you, Melanie," I replied coldly. "Move out of my way before I call the police." "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. Her fake superiority was completely gone, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. Jamal blocked my number. He cut off my credit cards. He froze the joint accounts. I have no money, Rebecca. None. I cannot even buy groceries. I stared at her, feeling absolutely zero sympathy. "You should have thought about that before you went online and accused me of being a financial abuser to protect a brother you knew was a criminal," I stated flatly. "You chose your side. Now you can live with the consequences of that choice." Melanie shook her head frantically, tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "You do not understand. It is not just about the money, it is about who Bradley owes. He did not just take money from those rich country club investors. When the funds started failing, he got desperate. He went to people he should never have spoken to, dangerous people." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She shoved the glowing screen toward my face. It was a log of incoming calls from unlisted numbers, followed by a series of text messages that chilled the air. They were explicit violent threats demanding immediate repayment of a massive loan complete with her exact home address and photos of her front door. "They are calling me Rebecca," she sobbed loudly in the middle of the parking lot. "The people he borrowed from. They said if they cannot find Bradley, they are coming to collect from his family. They are coming to my house. You have the money from the boat. You have your salary. You have to pay them off. You have to save us." I looked at the terrifying text messages, and then I looked back at the woman who had happily tried to ruin my life and my career just a few days ago. The audacity was truly breathtaking. She was actively demanding that I drain my own hard-earned savings to pay off mafia-linked loan sharks to save her from her brother's criminal choices. "I am not a part of your family anymore, Melanie," I said, my voice completely steady. "Your brother's debts are his problem, and if you are receiving threats, you need to go straight to the police, not to me. I am not giving you a single penny. Now step aside." Melanie's expression shifted instantly. The desperate fear morphed into the ugly, entitled rage I knew so well. "You selfish witch!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the pavement. "We are going to lose everything because of you." I ignored her, loading my groceries into the trunk of my Tesla. As I turned my back to return the cart, I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal. I spun around. Melanie was standing next to the driver's side door of my car, gripping a set of house keys, dragging them forcefully along the pristine paint job, leaving a deep, jagged scratch from the front quarter panel all the way to the rear door. I did not yell. I did not run toward her. I simply pulled out my phone and tapped the screen, opening the Tesla application. "You feel better now?" I asked calmly. Melanie glared at me, her chest heaving. "It is what you deserve," she spat. I smiled, holding up my phone. "You do realize this car is covered in high-definition Sentry cameras, right? It just recorded you committing felony property damage in 4K resolution. I am sending the footage directly to my lawyer and the police right now." Melanie dropped her keys, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She turned and sprinted away across the parking lot, crying hysterically as she ran. The next morning, a judge reviewed the undeniable dashcam footage and the threatening text messages she had shown me. I was immediately granted a comprehensive restraining order. A deputy served Melanie and the entire family, legally barring them from coming within 500 feet of my home, my car, or my workplace, under threat of immediate arrest. With the restraining order officially active, a temporary blanket of silence fell over my life. But as a forensic accountant, I know that silence from a desperate fraudster is never a sign of surrender. It is simply the quiet before the final explosion. Bradley was completely cornered. His sister was being hunted by loan sharks. His mother was a social pariah. His yacht was gone, and his deposition had practically gift-wrapped his federal indictment. He knew that the single sheet of paper I had slid across the table was just a fraction of the evidence I possessed. He knew I had the master ledgers, the unredacted bank statements, and the offshore routing numbers stored on a physical encrypted backup hard drive. In his fractured, panicked mind, Bradley convinced himself of a ridiculous legal theory. He believed that if he could physically destroy my backup drive before I handed it over to the federal authorities, they would not have enough concrete evidence to convict him. He thought he could break the chain of custody. He completely disregarded the fact that a restraining order was a legally binding document. He only saw a physical obstacle standing between him and his freedom. I anticipated exactly what he would do. Financial criminals are incredibly predictable when they are starved of options. They revert to brute force. Knowing this, I did not sleep in my condo that week. I packed a small suitcase and checked into a secure corporate hotel across town under a false name. Before I left, I spent an entire afternoon upgrading my home security. I installed 6 high-definition motion-activated night vision cameras. I placed them in the entryway, the living room, and specifically angled 2 of them directly at my home office desk. I synced the live feed to my secure laptop and connected the alert system directly to a private security dispatcher. Then I set the perfect bait. I purchased a heavy fireproof lockbox and placed it conspicuously on the bottom shelf of my office bookcase. Inside that lockbox, I placed a sleek, silver external hard drive. It looked incredibly important. It looked exactly like the kind of device a forensic accountant would use to store gigabytes of damning financial evidence. The trap was set. I only had to wait 3 days. At exactly 2 o'clock on a rainy Thursday morning, my laptop screen illuminated the dark hotel room. A sharp chime alerted me that motion had been detected at my front door. I sat up in bed, poured myself a glass of water, and opened the live camera feed. There he was. Bradley had used a spare physical key he must have secretly copied months ago to bypass the electronic deadbolt. He slipped into my dark entryway, wearing a black hooded sweatshirt and dark jeans. He looked like a common street thief, a far cry from the arrogant real estate mogul who used to demand I sign over my assets to him. The night vision cameras caught the wild, manic gleam in his eyes as he moved through my living room. He did not care about the expensive artwork or the electronics. He made a direct line for my home office. I watched in high definition as he began tearing my office apart. He ripped open drawers, tossing my client files onto the floor. He swept my pens and stationery off the desk in a fit of rage. Then his eyes locked onto the fireproof lockbox on the bottom shelf. I zoomed in on the camera feed, watching a triumphant, sickening smile spread across his face. He pulled a heavy steel pry bar out from his jacket and jammed it into the seam of the lockbox. He pushed down with all his weight, his face twisting with exertion, until the cheap metal hinge snapped violently. Bradley reached inside and pulled out the silver hard drive. He stared at it as if he had just found the Holy Grail. He let out a breathless, arrogant laugh, completely convinced he had just outsmarted me and saved himself from 10 years in a federal penitentiary. He shoved the hard drive deep into his jacket pocket, kicked the broken lockbox aside, and quickly walked out of my office. I did not call the police myself. I let the private security dispatcher handle the silent alarm I had authorized the moment he stepped foot inside the condo. I watched on the hallway camera as Bradley confidently strutted toward the front door, his hand resting on the doorknob. He pulled the heavy door open and stepped out into the cold night air of the exterior courtyard. But his victorious escape lasted exactly 2 seconds. The moment his expensive sneakers hit the concrete, the courtyard was instantly bathed in blinding, strobing red and blue lights. 4 Chicago Police Department cruisers had already completely surrounded the exit, their tires screeching as they formed an impenetrable barricade. The officers did not give him a chance to speak. They drew their weapons and ordered him to drop to the ground. Bradley froze, the stolen drive slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the wet pavement. 2 officers rushed forward, slamming him against the hood of a cruiser and reading him his rights. He was arrested for felony burglary and violating a restraining order. He spent the night shivering in a holding cell, stripped of his shoelaces. By morning, Patricia received the frantic phone call. She was already living in a cheap motel with Melanie, her high society life completely destroyed. But her blind devotion to her golden boy pushed her into making one final, catastrophic financial mistake. The judge set his bail at a staggering $250,000 due to his extreme and immediate flight risk. Patricia had no liquid assets left. In a desperate move, she contacted her broker and completely drained her very last personal retirement account. She willingly paid the massive penalty fees for early withdrawal and handed the remaining cash directly to a bail bondsman. She bankrupted her own future just to buy her son a few more days of freedom. Bradley walked out of the county jail that afternoon looking haggard, but immediately reverting to his arrogant self the moment he met with his newly hired criminal defense attorney. He had found a sleazy, aggressive lawyer named Mr. Higgins, a man known for exploiting every possible technicality in the Illinois legal code. Higgins reviewed the arrest report and the seized physical evidence and immediately found a massive, unexpected legal loophole. The following morning, we all met in the courtroom for his official arraignment. I sat quietly next to my lawyer David, watching as Higgins confidently approached the bench. Higgins argued that the burglary and theft charges were fundamentally flawed. He produced a credit card statement proving that the physical silver hard drive Bradley took had been purchased 2 years ago using a joint marital checking account. Because it was acquired before our official date of separation, Higgins argued it was technically joint marital property. Under current state law, a spouse cannot be charged with stealing their own legal property. Higgins aggressively petitioned the judge to drop the felony theft charges and demanded that the physical hard drive be released back into his custody immediately. The judge, bound by the strict technicalities of property law, reluctantly agreed to dismiss the theft charge and ordered the evidence locker to return the drive to his legal team. Bradley turned around from the defendant table and looked directly at me. A truly sickening, victorious smirk spread across his face. He mouthed the words, "I win," completely convinced that he had just secured the only copy of his financial ruin. He thought he had outsmarted the system, beaten the restraining order, and successfully retrieved the forensic evidence that would have sent him to federal prison. After the hearing, Bradley did not go back to the motel to thank his mother for bankrupting herself. He drove straight back to his failing commercial real estate office. He was eager to plug the drive into his company network, find the encrypted files I had compiled, and permanently delete every single ledger and offshore routing number. He wanted to watch his salvation disappear into the digital trash bin. I walked slowly out of the courtroom with David, the cool afternoon breeze hitting my face. David looked at me, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He asked me how I could be so calm after the judge just handed my ex-husband the entire forensic roadmap to his own criminal defense. I stopped on the concrete courthouse steps and simply smiled. I reached into my purse and pulled out a sleek black hard drive identical in weight, but entirely different in color. I did not put the forensic evidence on the silver drive, I told David, my voice light and completely unbothered. I am a forensic accountant. I handle highly sensitive corporate digital data for a living. I would never leave the actual master files sitting in a cheap lockbox in my home office. David stared at me, his eyes widening in realization. Then what exactly was on the drive he just took to his office? I looked down at my cell phone, a highly aggressive self-executing ransomware program I purchased on the dark web, I replied. The moment Bradley plugs that silver drive into his company's server to delete the files, the malware will automatically deploy. It is specifically designed to aggressively target, encrypt, and permanently wipe every single connected server, cloud backup, and internal network drive within mere seconds. My phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from my monitoring software. Bradley had just plugged it in. Within 10 seconds, a secondary alert confirmed the payload had successfully deployed. The malware was currently devouring his entire network, ripping through his cloud backups, and permanently encrypting his internal servers. I slid the phone back into my purse and walked toward my car, feeling absolutely weightless. Bradley was currently staring at a black screen of death, realizing he had just destroyed his own company infrastructure. But my digital trap was only one piece of the coordinated offensive. While Bradley was busy fighting a losing war against a computer virus, Jamal was executing a devastating legal strike against the rest of the family. Since Patricia had drained her retirement account to post bail, she and Melanie had retreated to the primary family mansion in the wealthy suburbs. It was their final remaining sanctuary, a massive, sprawling estate they foolishly believed was untouchable. They were completely wrong. At 9 o'clock the following morning, a black sedan pulled up the long, sweeping driveway of the estate. Jamal stepped out looking impeccably sharp in a tailored charcoal suit. He was accompanied by his attorney and a uniformed process server. Melanie opened the heavy oak front door wearing a silk robe, expecting a delivery. Instead, the process server handed her a thick stack of legal documents. Jamal did not raise his voice. He stood on the grand marble porch and calmly informed his wife that she was officially being sued for divorce. Melanie dropped the papers on the porch, her face contorting in shock. She tried to cry and play the victim, begging Jamal to come inside and talk about their marriage. "There is nothing left to talk about." "Melanie," Jamal said, his voice completely devoid of the warmth he once had for her. "You did not just lie to me. You committed massive financial infidelity." Jamal reached into his briefcase and pulled out a bound financial report. With my direct assistance as a forensic accountant, he had spent the last week meticulously tracing every single transaction originating from their joint accounts. Melanie had sworn she was spending his hard-earned surgical salary on interior design renovations and high-end fashion. The ledgers told a completely different story. She had been systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly into Bradley's fraudulent shell companies, disguised as anonymous cash infusions. She had forged Jamal's signature on wire transfers while he was busy performing grueling 12-hour spinal surgeries. "You stole my life savings to fund a Ponzi scheme," Jamal stated coldly, tossing the bound report at her feet. "But it gets much worse for you. I took these records straight to a family court judge yesterday afternoon." Patricia had walked out onto the porch just in time to hear the exchange. Her face went pale as Jamal's attorney stepped forward holding a second set of documents bearing a bright red court seal. Because Melanie had used Jamal's pristine credit and his medical income to secure the massive mortgage on this very estate, the judge was absolutely appalled by the documented financial abuse. The court granted Jamal an emergency freeze on the property. The attorney explained that the mansion was now under strict legal receivership. Patricia and Melanie were officially served with an emergency eviction notice. They had exactly 48 hours to pack their belongings and vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrived to physically remove them. The house was going to be liquidated immediately to compensate Jamal for the stolen funds. "You cannot do this," Patricia screamed, clutching her silk nightgown. "This is our family home. You cannot throw us out on the street like common trash." Jamal looked at his mother-in-law with absolute disgust. "You did that to yourselves," he replied, turning his back and walking toward his car. That evening, I was sitting at the desk in my hotel room, reviewing the final whistleblower documents I was preparing to submit. My phone began to ring, loudly vibrating against the wood. The caller identification displayed Patricia's name. I stared at the screen, feeling a deep sense of poetic justice. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went directly to voicemail. A minute later, the notification popped up indicating a new voice message. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker. The haughty, arrogant matriarch of the family was completely gone. "Rebecca." Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking with raw, desperate panic. "Please pick up the phone. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Jamal is taking the house. We have nowhere to go. I have no money left. I know Bradley ruined everything. I know he forged your signature. I will tell the federal prosecutors everything they want to know. I will testify against my own son in open court if you just talk to Jamal and let us keep the house. Please, Rebecca, do not let them throw me out." I listened to the message a second time, a slow smile spreading across my face. Patricia had just handed me the final nail for Bradley's coffin. I immediately downloaded the audio file of her desperate weeping confession and attached it directly to the digital federal whistleblower dossier I had been meticulously compiling. The case against them was no longer just about financial irregularities or a bitter divorce. It was a fully documented, self-admitted criminal conspiracy involving multiple members of the family. The trap was fully loaded, but Bradley, driven entirely by his psychotic need to maintain his high society facade, decided to dig his own grave just a little bit deeper. A normal person facing a ransomware attack that wiped their corporate servers, a frozen family trust, and the impending eviction of their mother would have surrendered. They would have hired a defense attorney and prepared for a plea deal. But Bradley was completely detached from reality. He genuinely believed that if he could just secure one massive influx of cash, he could fix everything. He could pay off the loan sharks, hunting his sister hire better lawyers to unfreeze the trust and flee the country. To achieve this, he orchestrated the most sickening, hypocritical event of his entire life. Using a newly opened line of credit under a fake subsidiary shell company, Bradley and Patricia rented out the Grand Astoria Ballroom, the most expensive and exclusive event space in downtown Chicago. They blasted digital invitations to every wealthy elite venture capitalist and old money socialite in the state. They billed the event as a massive charity gala aimed at raising $1 million for underprivileged orphans. It was a complete scam. There were no orphans. There was no registered charity. The entire gala was a frantic, elaborate theatrical production designed solely to extract desperate capital from unsuspecting victims under the guise of philanthropy. They thought they could control the guest list, but they severely underestimated the resources of a motivated forensic accountant and a furious orthopedic surgeon. Jamal and I did not sit at home while they attempted to rob the city blind. Using a corporate proxy LLC that Jamal had established years ago, we purchased 2 premium VIP tickets under completely fake names. We wanted a front row seat to the final collapse of their fraudulent empire. On Saturday night, Jamal and I arrived at the grand entrance of the ballroom. Jamal looked absolutely striking in a tailored black tuxedo, carrying himself with the quiet, powerful dignity of a man who had finally taken his life back. I wore a sleek, floor-length emerald green gown, my hair pinned back, carrying a small designer clutch that secretly held my encrypted smartphone. We handed our VIP tickets to the usher and walked right through the towering gold-plated front doors. The ballroom was an offensive display of stolen wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over dozens of round tables covered in white silk linens. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shapes of doves were positioned near the open bars, slowly melting onto silver trays. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with expensive champagne. The room was packed with the exact kind of wealthy targets Bradley desperately needed. We stayed near the back of the room, blending perfectly into the crowd of elites. I spotted Patricia standing near the entrance, attempting to play the role of the grand matriarch. It was incredibly pathetic. I knew for a fact that the county sheriff was scheduled to physically evict her from the family mansion in exactly 12 hours. Yet there she was, draped in borrowed diamonds, forcing a tight, panicked smile as she greeted the guests. Bradley was working the floor, sweating profusely through his expensive suit. He was holding a glass of scotch, laughing too loudly and aggressively, shaking hands with older men in tuxedos, undoubtedly pitching his fake real estate fund under the guise of charitable investments. He had absolutely no idea that the federal government was already reviewing the audio recording of his mother selling him out, nor did he realize that Jamal and I were standing less than 50 feet away. I leaned against a marble pillar and quietly opened my clutch. I pulled out my smartphone and connected to the private venue wireless network using administrative credentials I had easily bypassed earlier that afternoon. I navigated to the audio-visual control panel interface, holding my finger hovering right over the master volume controls. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, signaling the start of the evening presentation. A spotlight hit the grand stage at the front of the room. Bradley confidently walked up the carpeted stairs and stepped behind the clear acrylic podium. He adjusted his silk tie, tapped the microphone twice, and smiled warmly at the crowd of wealthy victims. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Bradley began, his voice booming clearly through the massive speakers. "Tonight is about giving back. It is about honoring the pristine legacy of my family and demonstrating our unwavering commitment to family values and the less fortunate." I looked at Jamal, who gave me a sharp, satisfying nod. I looked back down at my glowing screen and firmly tapped the master override button. Right as Bradley opened his mouth to ask for their money, the microphone cut out with a deafening, high-pitched electronic screech that made half the room cover their ears. The screech echoed through the grand ballroom. Guests winced, dropping champagne flutes onto the silk tablecloths. Bradley tapped the microphone frantically, his face flushing red, as he shouted at the sound technicians behind the glass booth. But the technicians were completely locked out of the system. From my phone, I executed the next command. The massive 20-foot screens behind the stage, supposed to display touching photographs of a local orphanage, suddenly flared to life with blinding white light. A collective gasp rippled through the wealthy crowd as the first slide appeared in stunning high definition. It was not a charity logo. It was a scanned copy of the $500,000 commercial loan application, complete with the forged signature of my name and the corrupt notary stamp. Beside it, a bright red arrow pointed to the IP address, confirming the application originated directly from Bradley's home office router. Before Bradley could even turn around to see what the entire room was staring at, the slide transitioned automatically. Now the screen displayed the internal ledgers of his family investment fund side by side with his personal offshore banking records. I color-coded the transactions so even a layman could instantly understand the fraud. The green numbers showed the millions of dollars deposited by the elite investors sitting in this very room. Red lines tracked those exact funds being wired directly to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. And then came the gambling debts. Scanned markers from high-stakes casinos in Las Vegas flashed across the screens, detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars blown on baccarat over the past 3 years. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The hushed murmurs of high society vanished, replaced instantly by the furious shouting of billionaires who realized they had been conned. Men in tuxedos were pulling out their cell phones, frantically dialing their wealth managers and defense attorneys. Women were pointing at the stage, their faces twisted in pure disgust. The venture capitalist who had confronted Bradley on the yacht was marching toward the stage, his fists clenched, screaming for Bradley to give him his $2 million back immediately. Bradley finally turned around and saw the 20-foot-tall evidence of his federal crimes illuminated for the entire city to see. He snapped. His crafted persona shattered into a million tiny pieces. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice raw and hysterical without the microphone. "Turn it off!" he roared, spit flying from his lips. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a heavy crystal vase sitting on a nearby VIP table. He grabbed the vase, dumping the water, and imported orchids onto the floor, and sprinted toward the front of the stage. He launched the heavy crystal vase through the air, aiming directly for the expensive projector suspended from the ceiling. But his aim was terrible. The vase missed the projector, entirely crashing into the drywall behind the stage and shattering into dangerous razor-sharp shards that rained down on the carpet. Bradley did not stop. He grabbed a metal folding chair from the side of the stage and began violently smashing it against the digital screen, tearing the expensive fabric. He was completely unaware that hitting the display surface would not delete the digital files being broadcasted from my encrypted phone. He looked like a rabid animal trapped in a cage. Jamal stood beside me, watching the spectacular meltdown with his arms crossed. He leaned in and whispered that it was the most beautiful disaster he had ever witnessed. I smiled, keeping my finger hovering over the control screen. But the absolute climax of the evening did not come from Bradley or his violent tantrum. It came from the woman who had created the monster in the first place. Patricia watched her entire social standing evaporate in real time. She saw the furious investors, the undeniable evidence of federal crimes, and her son acting like a violent lunatic on a stage. Her pristine survival instincts took over. She realized the sinking ship was finally going under, and she refused to drown with him. Patricia marched up the stage stairs, her heels clicking aggressively. She shoved past her crazed son and grabbed a secondary microphone from the podium stand. It was a direct line to the backup speakers I intentionally left unmuted just for her. Patricia pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at Bradley. Her voice echoed over the shouting crowd, dripping with venom and betrayal. "He did it!" She screamed, her face pale with absolute panic. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this. He stole your money. He forged the documents. He lied to me and he lied to all of you. He is a criminal and he deserves to go to prison." Bradley stood frozen on the stage, the crystal shards of the broken vase crunching beneath his expensive leather shoes. The absolute betrayal from his own mother hit him harder than the financial ruin. For his entire life, Patricia had been his ultimate shield, the woman who covered up his mistakes and fueled his monstrous ego. Now she was standing under the glaring spotlight, eagerly offering him up as a sacrificial lamb to save herself. The wealthy investors in the crowd did not care about their toxic family dynamic. They surged forward, a tidal wave of furious billionaires in tailored tuxedos, their voices blending into a deafening roar, demanding immediate justice and the return of their wealth. Bradley looked at the angry mob, then looked at his mother, who had already turned her back on him to cry fake tears of victimhood for the nearest venture capitalist. The instinct to survive finally overpowered his shock. He dropped the metal folding chair, turned away from the blinding 20-foot digital screens, broadcasting his crimes, and bolted toward the rear exit of the grand stage. He sprinted down the narrow back hallway of the ballroom, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He shoved past terrified catering staff, knocking a tray of expensive champagne glasses into the wall. The crystal shattered, but he did not look back. His mind was racing, calculating how much cash he had hidden in his personal safe at home, wondering if he could make it to the private airfield before the local police were called. He just needed to get through the heavy double doors leading out to the private VIP red carpet entrance at the back of the venue. He hit the push bar on the doors with all of his body weight, expecting to burst out into the quiet, cold Chicago night. Instead, the heavy glass doors swung open to reveal a scene out of his absolute worst nightmares. The private alleyway was entirely bathed in blinding, strobing red and blue lights. But these were not the standard cruisers of the Chicago Police Department. 5 massive black armored SUVs formed a solid steel barricade across the entire width of the exit, completely cutting off any possible escape route. Bradley stumbled to a halt on the plush red carpet, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes from the intense glare of the high-beam spotlights mounted on the vehicles. Dozens of heavily armed men and women were already moving in perfect calculated formation. They were not wearing standard blue police uniforms. As they stepped into the harsh lighting, Bradley could clearly read the bold, stark yellow letters printed across the backs of their dark windbreakers. The FBI. And right beside them, agents wearing jackets marked for the IRSCI, the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. This was not a local civil dispute anymore. This was a full-scale, highly coordinated federal raid. A tall, imposing federal agent with a severe expression stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He did not yell or act frantic. He possessed the terrifying cold authority of a man who knew he had already won. Bradley, the agent, said, his voice easily carrying over the hum of the heavy SUV engines. "Do not make another move. Keep your hands exactly where I can see them." Bradley was trembling so violently his knees practically buckled. He slowly lowered his hands, looking around for any possible gap in the barricade, but there was nowhere to run. Jamal and I stepped out through the glass doors right behind him, standing at the top of the red carpet steps. I folded my arms, the cool night air feeling incredibly refreshing after the stifling heat of the crowded ballroom. The federal agent marched directly up to Bradley, grabbing his wrist with practiced efficiency and twisting his arm securely behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed in the cold alleyway. "You are under arrest," the agent stated, his tone flat and unyielding. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and severe tax evasion." Bradley thrashed against the heavy steel cuffs, his perfectly styled hair, now a tangled, sweaty mess, hanging over his wild eyes. The realization that his life was officially over finally broke whatever was left of his sanity. He twisted his head, locking his crazed, bloodshot eyes onto me as I stood calmly at the top of the stairs. He bared his teeth like a trapped animal desperately clinging to his last remaining delusion. "You have no proof!" Bradley screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria as the federal agents dragged him right down the red carpet. "You have no proof, Rebecca." I walked slowly down the plush red carpeted stairs, the cool night air biting at my bare shoulders. The flashing red and blue lights of the armored SUVs painted the brick alleyway in chaotic, pulsing colors. The federal agents paused for just a moment, holding Bradley firmly by his arms, allowing me to close the distance between us. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, still trying to project that arrogant defiance, even with his wrists locked in cold steel. "You destroyed the evidence," Bradley spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and misplaced confidence. "You have nothing. It is a civil dispute. My lawyers will have me out of here in an hour." I stopped just 2 feet away from him, looking at the pathetic, broken man I had once called my husband. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You really thought this was just about a divorce?" I asked, my tone conversational and remarkably calm. "You thought I spent all those sleepless nights compiling your financial ledgers just to save my condo and avoid paying you alimony?" "Bradley, I am a forensic accountant. I do not just settle domestic disputes. I hunt corporate criminals for a living. And you are the easiest target I have ever tracked." Bradley blinked, his eyes darting between me and the stern federal agents holding him. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its aggressive edge. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of heavy watermark paper. I held it up in the harsh police lighting so he could read the bold federal seal printed at the top. This is an official confirmation receipt for Internal Revenue Service. Form 211. I explained clearly, making sure every word sank into his fractured mind. It is the federal application for an award for original information. It is the whistleblower form. I did not start investigating you when you kicked me out on Christmas Eve. I started investigating you 9 months ago, the moment I noticed the first irregular wire transfer from your family trust. Bradley stared at the paper, the color rapidly draining from his face. His jaw went slack. I did not just hand my divorce lawyer a few bank statements. I continued, stepping slightly closer so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I handed the United States government a perfectly packaged, 300-page forensic audit of your entire Ponzi scheme. I provided them with every single forged document, every fake offshore routing number, every hidden shell company, and every illegal casino marker. I gave them the exact IP addresses you used to move stolen money and the complete financial footprint of your father's previous crimes. I gift-wrapped your entire criminal enterprise and handed it directly to the federal prosecutors. But the hard drive, Bradley stammered, his eyes wide and wild. I took the hard drive from your office. I smiled deeply, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. The silver drive you stole was a decoy loaded with ransomware, I reminded him. The FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division have possessed the actual master files for months. They were not waiting for evidence. They already had it. They were simply waiting for you to commit a few more desperate, undeniable federal crimes to guarantee a conviction without a trial. Things like selling a multi-million-dollar yacht you bought with stolen funds, or attempting to open a massive commercial loan using my stolen Social Security number across state lines. You gave them everything they needed to put you away for a very long time. And let us not forget your mother, I added, my voice cutting through the cold air. That audio recording of her begging me to save the house, where she openly admitted to knowing about your forged signatures and illegal transfers. I attached that to the whistleblower file too. The federal warrant includes her as a co-conspirator. The federal agent holding Bradley's left arm shifted his grip. Your wife did our job for us, the agent stated flatly. The warrant we executed tonight includes a total federal asset forfeiture. I watched the exact moment Bradley's mind completely shattered. He finally understood what those words meant. When Jamal froze the family trust, the money was simply held in escrow pending a civil investigation. But a federal asset forfeiture meant the United States government had officially seized everything. His offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were gone. The fake shell companies were liquidated. His luxury cars, his designer watches, the remaining cash in his personal safes were all property of the federal government now. He had absolutely nothing left. He was not just broke. He was a multi-million-dollar debtor facing a decade in federal prison. Bradley's knees buckled. If the agents had not been holding him upright, he would have collapsed onto the concrete. He let out a low, agonizing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. There was no more arrogance. There was no more fake high society pride. As they dragged him toward the back of the armored SUV, he did not fight back. He just stared blankly at the pavement, completely and utterly ruined. The echo of his desperate scream faded into the cold night as the heavy steel doors of the armored SUV slammed shut, cutting him off from the world. I did not have to ride with him to the federal building to know exactly how his final moments of defiance crumbled. As the primary whistleblower and key forensic witness, the federal prosecutors provided my legal team with the complete transcripts and audio recordings of his interrogation the very next morning. While I was safely escorted home by a private security detail, Bradley was dragged into a windowless concrete interrogation room deep inside the federal building. The stark fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, highlighting every single flaw on his pale, sweating face. His custom-tailored tuxedo was torn and stained with dirt from the alleyway. His hands were uncuffed from behind his back, only to be chained directly to a heavy steel ring bolted to the center of the metal table. He sat there shivering violently for 2 agonizing hours before the heavy iron door finally opened. The tall federal agent from the alleyway walked in, accompanied by a senior investigator from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They did not introduce themselves. They did not offer him a glass of water. The IRS agent simply dropped a massive, heavily bound cardboard box onto the metal table. The box landed with a deafening thud. It was the physical printed copy of my 300-page forensic audit. Bradley took one look at the box, and his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He immediately waived his right to an attorney, genuinely believing he could talk his way out of a federal indictment. He leaned across the metal table, the chains rattling against the steel, and launched into a frantic, pathetic monologue. He decided to play his final card. He decided to throw his own mother directly under the federal bus. "Listen to me," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "You have the wrong person. I am just the public face of the investment fund. I shake hands and host the galas. I do not handle the actual accounting. My mother, Patricia, is the sole managing director of the family trust. She is the one who controls the capital. She forced me to take those loans. She orchestrated the offshore transfers to the Cayman Islands because she has a severe gambling addiction. I was just following her strict orders to protect the family name. I am a victim of her financial abuse." The 2 federal agents sat perfectly still in their metal chairs, their faces entirely devoid of emotion. They let him speak uninterrupted for 10 solid minutes, allowing him to permanently record his desperate lies and fully incriminate his mother. When Bradley finally ran out of breath, leaning back in his chair, panting heavily, the lead FBI agent slowly reached into his suit jacket. He did not pull out a legal pad or a pen. He pulled out a small digital audio player. He placed it carefully on the metal table right next to the massive box of financial evidence. "That is a fascinating story," the FBI agent said, his voice dangerously low. "But it directly contradicts the evidence provided by our primary witness. Let us see what your mother has to say about who is really in charge." The agent pressed the play button. The tiny speaker crackled to life, and the unmistakable, haughty voice of Patricia filled the sterile interrogation room. It was the crystal-clear recording I had captured at the coffee shop. Bradley sat frozen in horror as he listened to his mother brag about teaching him how to financially abuse his wife. He heard her explicitly confirm that she told him to forge my signature on the commercial loan. He heard her call the federal wire fraud a simple matter of cutting through unnecessary red tape. The audio clip ended. The heavy silence in the interrogation room was absolutely suffocating. Bradley stared at the digital player, his mouth hanging open. "Do you know what that recording is, Bradley?" the IRS agent asked, leaning forward. "That is a textbook confession to a criminal conspiracy. Your mother just admitted on tape that you both colluded to commit federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. You just tried to blame her and she already incriminated you. Both of you are going to federal prison for a very long time." The last shred of Bradley's sanity completely snapped. The realization that he was totally trapped with no money, no lawyer, and no mother to hide behind finally broke him. He began to hyperventilate, tugging frantically at the heavy steel chains binding him to the table. "I need my phone," Bradley begged, tears streaming down his face. "Please, you have to let me make a phone call. I need to call my wife. I need to talk to Rebecca. She can fix this. She can explain the numbers. Just let me call her." The 2 federal agents looked at each other and let out a cold, genuine laugh. "You really do not get it, do you?" the FBI agent said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You are not allowed to contact her. In fact, nobody is. Your wife is currently unavailable. She is sitting upstairs in a secure conference room, having a closed-door meeting with the United States Attorney to finalize your permanent asset forfeiture." 2 weeks after the federal raid, the crisp autumn air over Chicago carried the chilling reality of absolute ruin. Bradley was sitting in a federal detention center, completely denied bail due to the staggering amount of evidence against him and his documented status as a massive flight risk. The story of his fraudulent charity gala had completely saturated the local news cycle. The pristine family legacy he had spent his entire life bragging about was publicly dismantled on the front page of every financial newspaper in the city. But the ultimate consequence of his actions finally arrived at the front door of the sprawling suburban estate on a quiet Tuesday morning. Patricia and Melanie had spent the last 14 days barricaded inside the mansion, intentionally ignoring the emergency eviction notices Jamal and the federal government had served them. They deluded themselves into believing that their high society connections would somehow magically intervene. They thought the bank would grant them an extension. They were wrong. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy brass knocker on the grand oak front door echoed through the silent, empty halls of the estate. Patricia, wearing a faded silk robe, opened the door ready to yell at whichever reporter had bypassed the front gate. Instead, she found herself staring directly at the gold badges of 4 United States Marshals accompanied by 2 armed deputies from the county sheriff department. The lead marshal did not mince words. He held up a clipboard bearing a federal seizure warrant and a final notice of eviction. He informed Patricia that the property was now under the strict legal receivership of the federal government and the bank. They were no longer the owners of the home, nor were they permitted to remain on the premises. "You have exactly 30 minutes to gather your personal clothing and essential toiletries," the marshal commanded, his voice echoing in the grand foyer. "Any items of significant financial value, including jewelry, electronics, artwork, and designer luggage, are officially classified as seized assets pending the federal fraud investigation. If you attempt to remove them from this property, you will be arrested for theft of government property." Melanie came rushing down the sweeping marble staircase, her face pale with terror, as the armed federal agents stepped into her living room. The deputies handed both women thick, heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. The sheer indignity of the moment struck Patricia like a physical blow. The matriarch of the family, a woman who had spent decades looking down her nose at everyone she deemed beneath her, was now being ordered to pack her life into trash bags under the watchful eyes of armed law enforcement. For 25 minutes, the mansion was filled with the sounds of frantic sobbing and the rustling of cheap plastic. Melanie tried to sneak a diamond tennis bracelet into her pocket, but a deputy immediately caught her, strictly warning her that she was one strike away from handcuffs. They were forced to leave behind the imported silk dresses, the fur coats, and the expensive shoes they had purchased with stolen money. They stuffed old sweatpants, basic shirts, and cheap toiletries into the black bags, their tears staining their clothes. As the 30-minute deadline expired, the marshals escorted them out the front door. Melanie dropped her garbage bags on the grand stone porch in a state of sheer panic. She pulled out her cell phone, her hands trembling violently. In a final act of utter desperation, she dialed the only person she thought could save her from this nightmare. She called Jamal. She planned to beg him to promise him anything, to use his guilt to secure a warm bed and a hot meal. She pressed the phone to her ear, tears streaming down her face. But it did not ring. Instead, a cold automated carrier message played through the speaker. "The number you have reached has been disconnected and is no longer in service." Jamal had not just filed for divorce. He had completely erased her from his life, changing his number and cutting off the last possible lifeline she had left. The deputies instructed them to start walking. Because their luxury vehicles had already been repossessed by the bank, Patricia and Melanie were forced to drag their heavy black garbage bags down the long, winding paved driveway on foot. The wheels of high society had completely crushed them. They had pooled the last $200 of untainted cash they possessed to book a single room at a rundown, roach-infested motel on the absolute worst side of town. They reached the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, exhausted, shivering, and entirely defeated. Patricia leaned against the cold metal, looking back at the beautiful mansion she would never step foot inside again. They stood on the edge of the public road, waiting for a cheap taxicab to take them to their miserable new reality. But the vehicle that turned onto the street and slowly approached the gates was not a yellow cab. It was a sleek, immaculate black luxury car. The vehicle glided to a smooth halt right in the center of the driveway, its tinted windows gleaming in the morning sun. The heavy passenger door of the black luxury sedan swung open. A driver in a sharp suit stepped out and held the door for me. I stepped onto the pristine driveway wearing a tailored white trench coat and oversized sunglasses. Patricia and Melanie stood frozen on the other side of the wrought iron gates, clutching their cheap black garbage bags. Their jaws practically hit the concrete. They expected a taxi to take them to their roach-infested motel. They never expected me to arrive in a chauffeured car looking like the absolute victor of a war they started. I walked slowly toward the gate, the heels of my designer shoes clicking against the pavement. Let me take a moment to explain exactly how the United States federal tax system handles massive corporate fraud. When you uncover a multi-million-dollar financial crime, you do not just get a pat on the back from the government. Under the IRS whistleblower program, if the money recovered exceeds $2 million, the informant is legally entitled to a mandatory reward ranging from 15 to 30% of the total recovered assets. Through my forensic audit, the Internal Revenue Service successfully tracked and seized exactly $20 million in hidden offshore accounts, fake shell companies, and untaxed real estate holdings connected to Bradley and his family trust. The government took everything they had stolen. And because my 300-page dossier handed them the entire case on a silver platter, the U.S. Treasury Department authorized a maximum payout for my cooperation. Just 3 days ago, I received a direct wire transfer from the federal government for a completely legal, tax-free reward of exactly $4 million. Bradley had kicked me out on Christmas Eve because he thought my condo was his only financial lifeline. Now I possessed more liquid cash than his entire fake real estate fund had ever generated. Patricia gripped the iron bars of the gate, her knuckles turning white. "What are you doing here, Rebecca?" she hissed, her voice raspy and pathetic. "Did you come to gloat? Did you come to laugh at two homeless women? You have ruined our family. You have sent my son to prison. Are you finally satisfied?" I took off my sunglasses and looked her directly in the eyes. "I did not ruin your family, Patricia," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "Your greed ruined your family. I just did the math." Before she could spit another venomous insult, a second vehicle pulled up behind my sedan. It was a silver luxury SUV. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He was the senior liquidator and real estate agent representing the major commercial bank that had just foreclosed on the mansion. He walked over to me, completely ignoring the two women standing on the street corner with their garbage bags. "Good morning, Rebecca," the agent said with a warm, professional smile. "I have the final transfer documents ready for your signature." The bank was incredibly eager to process an all-cash offer on a property of this size. It saves us months of painful litigation and auction fees. Patricia gasped, taking a step back as if she had just been slapped across the face. She looked back and forth between me and the real estate agent, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. She could not process the fact that I was conducting a massive financial transaction right on her former driveway. I reached into my trench coat pocket and pulled out a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. It was a certified cashier check printed directly from my new high-yield private bank account. The amount written on the check was exactly $2.5 million. It was a heavily discounted price for a massive suburban estate, but the bank wanted it off their books immediately. I handed the check to the agent. He inspected it carefully, nodded his approval, and handed me a thick stack of finalized property deeds and a set of heavy brass keys. "You bought my house," Patricia whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror. "You used the money you got from ruining my son to buy my family home. This is sick, Rebecca. This is completely psychotic." I signed the final line of the contract and handed the clipboard back to the agent. I turned to Patricia, feeling an overwhelming sense of closure. "Actually, Patricia," I said, holding up the heavy brass keys, "it is not your family home anymore. It now belongs entirely to me. I bought it free and clear today. And since I am now the legal property owner, I am going to have to ask you to step away from my front gate. You are loitering on my property." Patricia stood there on the pavement, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She finally realized the absolute finality of her situation. With a sharp nod to the real estate agent, I turned my back on her and got back into my chauffeured car, leaving them standing on the curb clutching their garbage bags. The heavy iron gates of the estate closed slowly behind me, locking out the parasites forever. Fast forward exactly 3 months. The biting chill of winter had fully descended upon Chicago, mirroring the cold, unforgiving reality waiting inside the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. I walked through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, my heels echoing against the polished marble floors. I scanned the crowded wooden pews. Jamal was already sitting in the back row wearing a sharp navy suit and projecting an aura of complete peace. I slid into the bench next to him, returning his quiet nod of solidarity. We were not there to testify today. The trial had never even happened. Faced with the mountain of undeniable whistleblower evidence, both Bradley and Patricia had accepted plea deals to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives behind bars. Today was simply about the sentencing. The heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench swung open. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery, which was packed with the furious, wealthy investors who had been scammed at the charity gala. The defendants were led into the room by armed federal marshals. Patricia walked in first, her hands securely shackled to a heavy waist chain. She was wearing a baggy bright orange jumpsuit. The woman who had spent decades meticulously cultivating a high society image, dripping in imported silks and borrowed diamonds, now looked entirely small, frail, and insignificant. Her graying hair was tied back in a messy knot, and she kept her eyes glued to the floor, unable to look at the country club friends she had robbed. When the federal judge addressed her, he did not hold back. He cited the explicit recorded confession from the coffee shop, noting that a mother who actively coaches her son to commit federal wire fraud and identity theft deserves absolutely no leniency. Patricia tried to interrupt, weeping loudly and begging for house arrest due to her age, but the judge quickly silenced her. The gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. Patricia was officially sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for criminal conspiracy. She let out a sharp, agonizing sob, her shoulders shaking violently as the marshals forced her to sit back down in her metal chair. Then it was Bradley's turn to stand. He looked like a hollow, rotting shell of the arrogant real estate mogul he had once pretended to be. His skin was pale and sunken, his posture entirely defeated, his wrists chained just like his mother. He stood before the federal judge, his head bowed in shame. The judge read through the staggering list of charges, detailing the $20 million stolen from innocent investors, the forged commercial loan documents, the illegal offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the desperate, pathetic attempt to steal forensic evidence from my home. The judge looked directly at Bradley and stated that his actions were driven by pure, unadulterated greed and a psychotic need to maintain a fraudulent lifestyle at the expense of his own family. Because this was the federal justice system, there was no chance for early parole. You serve exactly what you are given. The sentence was handed down with absolute cold precision. 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, bank fraud, and tax evasion. I sat perfectly still, listening to the heavy sentence echo through the massive courtroom. Jamal let out a slow, deep breath next to me, finally closing the darkest chapter of his life. He leaned over and whispered that Melanie had not even bothered to show up to support them, too busy working a minimum-wage retail job just to survive. The marshals stepped forward, grabbing Bradley by the arms. For the first time in their lives, the golden child and his toxic mother were exactly equal. They were just 2 federal inmates wearing matching orange jumpsuits, stripped of their power, their stolen money, and their fake prestige. As the marshals began to lead them down the center aisle toward the holding cells, Bradley stopped walking. He dug his heels into the carpet and turned his head, searching the gallery until his bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine. He looked incredibly pathetic. His expression was a desperate plea for pity, hoping to see even a fraction of the woman who used to love him, hoping to see some sign that I felt bad for destroying his life. He wanted to be the victim one last time. I did not break eye contact. I did not frown, and I certainly did not offer him a single ounce of pity. Instead, a slow, completely genuine smile spread across my face. I casually lifted my left wrist, letting the bright courtroom lights catch the sparkling face of the brand new, incredibly expensive diamond watch I had purchased just yesterday. I checked the time, completely ignoring his desperate stare, and turned my attention to Jamal to ask where we were going for a celebratory lunch. Bradley was violently yanked forward by the marshals, his face twisting in absolute agony as the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate and officially closing the darkest chapter of my life. I walked out of that federal building with Jamal, the freezing Chicago wind, feeling like a welcoming embrace. We had won. Exactly 1 year later, the atmosphere could not have been more different. It was Christmas Eve. Outside, a gentle snow was falling over the sprawling grounds of my massive suburban estate. Inside the mansion was entirely transformed. When Patricia and Bradley lived here, the house was a cold, sterile museum designed only to impress people they secretly despised. The dining room table used to be a miserable battleground of passive-aggressive insults and financial manipulation. Tonight it was filled with warmth, genuine laughter, and the rich scent of roasted pine, honey, glazed ham, and cinnamon. I walked into the grand living room, holding a glass of vintage red wine. A massive, beautifully decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner, glowing with warm lights and reflecting off the polished hardwood floors. Standing by the grand stone fireplace was Jamal. He looked absolutely incredible. The heavy, exhausting burden he used to carry around his shoulders was completely gone. He looked 10 years younger. After finalizing his divorce from Melanie, he had taken his massive surgical income and opened his own private orthopedic clinic. Without a toxic family draining his bank accounts every single week, his wealth and his peace of mind had skyrocketed. He was currently laughing at a joke told by my boss, Mr. Henderson, who had happily accepted my invitation to dinner. Mr. Henderson raised his glass to me as I approached. My career had not just survived Melanie's pathetic social media smear campaign, it had launched into the stratosphere. After the federal government officially used my forensic dossier to dismantle a $20 million Ponzi scheme, my reputation in the financial sector became legendary. Clients were practically begging for my services, knowing I was the accountant who took down her own corrupt husband with ruthless precision. 6 months ago, Mr. Henderson had called me into his office and offered me a full equity partnership at the firm. At 34 years old, I was now one of the youngest and most powerful forensic partners in the entire city. As I stood in my beautiful home surrounded by people who genuinely respected and cared for me, I could not help but think about where the others were spending their holidays. Patricia was currently sitting in a minimum security federal prison camp, forced to wear an orange jumpsuit and eat mass-produced cafeteria food. Melanie was likely standing behind a cash register at a retail store working a double shift on Christmas Eve just to pay the rent on her tiny, dilapidated apartment. And then there was Bradley. I looked out the large bay windows into the snowy night, imagining him sitting in a cold, concrete 6-by-8-foot cell in a federal penitentiary. He had absolutely no money, no fancy suits, and no legacy left to hide behind. He was just federal inmate number 8472, a man who would spend the next decade of his life staring at a steel toilet. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my wine, reflecting on how this entire journey began exactly 1 year ago. I remembered the sheer arrogance in his voice that night at the dinner table. I remembered how he slammed his fist down, demanding I hand over my only independent asset to save his fraudulent empire. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to get out of his house. He called me an idiot. He told me not to talk to him. I did exactly what he asked. I got out of his house. I walked out into the cold, locked my accounts, and never spoke another word of submission to him again. He thought because he was born into a wealthy family he was untouchable. He thought because I was his wife, I was weak, dependent, and easily manipulated. He completely underestimated the sheer power of a woman who knows exactly what she is worth and exactly how to trace a stolen dollar. I used my brains, my financial independence, and the absolute full weight of the United States legal system to completely destroy his life. Today, he is sitting in a cage entirely stripped of his dignity, while I am sitting at the head of the table in the very mansion he used to call his family legacy. People often say that the best revenge is living well, but as a forensic accountant, I have to disagree. Revenge is best served with a pristine audit trail. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation and rebuild your life on your own terms? Have you ever watched karma finally catch up to the people who underestimated you? I would love to hear your incredible stories of resilience and triumph in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about claiming your worth and fighting back. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, never let anyone tell you that you do not deserve the space you have worked so hard to build.